In 2010, I brought Christopher Marlowe's play The Jew of Malta, in which, just like in almost all the other books, was given a section of the introduction. It introduced me to the critic named Calvin Hoffman, who believed that there was no Shakespeare but Marlowe. Actually, according to the accepted biography of Marlowe, it is believed that he died in a fight. But Calvin Hoffman believed that Marlowe managed to escape the fight and continued writing under the name of William Shakespeare. Though it was a small paragraph, it forced me into the months of labor. Soon, instead of reading more of Shakespeare, I read more on who wrote Shakespeare. And interestingly, I found out that Shakespeare's authorship question is not limited to Marlowe, but there are about tens, if not hundreds of other candidates, including Francis Bacon, Edmund Spenser, and Edward de Vere. But my labor ended in the summer of 2011 when I read about Delia Bacon, who dedicated a good amount of her life in proving that the plays that the world has attributed to a man named Shakespeare were written by the group of men which included the likes of Sir Walter Raleigh. After extensive research on the topic, she published her theory in the book titled The Philosophy of the Plays of Shakespeare Unfolded, only to be denounced by the critics of the time. Soon after, she suffered a mental illness which ultimately resulted in her unfortunate demise. The end of Delia Bacon's life was kind of tragic for me and got me thinking, what if the world had accepted her theory? What difference would it have made then? I thought none, because it does not matter. At least to me. By the way, please let me know your opinions in the comment section below. What mattered to me was the fact that I love those sonnets and plays, and if Christopher Marlowe was the one who wrote it, my admiration for those plays and sonnets would have remained just the same, like the rose that smells just as sweet even if we call it gulab. And somehow, to quote Michel Foucault, I became murderer of the author. Hello and welcome to Literoseious. I'm Yash Purohit, and in this video I'm going to explain Roland Barthes' essay, The Death of the Author. The English version of The Death of the Author was first published in 1967, while in French it was published in the following year. 10 years later, it was included in Barthes' anthology of essay titled Image, Music, Text. The Death of the Author serves as a bridge from where Barthes traveled from the structuralist thinking to the post-structuralist. The essay is remarkable not only for the idea that it propels, but also for its shortness and accessible language. The essay is divided into 7 paragraphs of reasonable length, and the argument that Barthes makes for the death of the author is much better than the one made by my younger self. Barthes opens the essay with Balzac's novella Sarrasine, in which Balzac, describing a castrato disguised as a woman, writes, "This was a woman herself, with her sudden fears, her irrational whims, her instinctive worries, her impetuous boldness, her fuzzing, and her delicious sensibility." Barthes asks, who exactly is the one speaking this sentence? Is it the hero Sarrasine who is hiding the identity of castrato in disguise? Or is it Balzac the individual writing from his own experience, as in his personal life, with philosophy of woman? Or is it Balzac the author who is professing certain literary idea of femininity? The truth is, we can never know. Not only because Balzac is long dead and gone, but even if Balzac were alive today, we still cannot be sure whose voice is behind that sentence. The reason is that writing in itself is a special voice, and it is made up of several different voices which cannot be distinguished. Literature is an invention of this special voice, that is to say, text. Therefore, it is impossible to assign a specific origin to it. Hence, Barthes writes, writing is that neutral, composite, oblique space where our subject slips away, the negative where all identity is lost, starting with the very identity of the body writing. In short, Barthes says that writing is a trap where all identity is lost, starting with the identity of the writer itself. Supporting his statement, Barthes says in the second paragraph that writing is an intransitive activity. That is to say, it does not act directly upon the objective reality. Since it is a work of imagination, it is external to all the real functions, except for the practice of symbols, that is to say, language. Therefore, as soon as the writing begins, the author enters his own death, because there is no relation between the reality of the author and the language. Barthes further supports his argument that in primitive societies, the authority over the narration is never assumed by a person, but by a speaker or a mediator whose performance may be admired but never is genius for creating such a story. Barthes says that the emergence of the author is a modern development of Western world which can be traced back to the Renaissance. With the birth of humanism, the Western world started emphasizing the intellect of a man and displaced the god. It then continued with English empiricism, French rationalism and personal faith of Reformation, which led to the discovery of the individual prestige or the human person. All this combined gave birth to the philosophical positivism, which emphasizes only on the observable and verifiable phenomena. And finally, it culminated in capitalism, which then gave birth to the idea of the author behind the work of art and literature. And this author still rules in the literary world, in the biographies of the writers, in interviews and in magazines. It is almost impossible to separate the work of art from the author. In every book, we still find a section titled About Author. We always try to find the explanation of the work in the man or the woman who produced it, as if his or her words are the final. Even though for the most part of the history the author remained a powerful entity, Barthes says that writers such as Mohammed and Proust tried to loosen the authority of the author. Mohammed tried to substitute language for person because it is language that speaks to the reader and not the author. And Proust tried to blur the relation between the writer and his character by making the narrator someone who is going to write instead of the one who has witnessed everything or who is writing the novel. Instead of putting his life into his novel, as is so often maintained, Barthes writes, he made of his life a work for which his own book was the model. Further, he says that language knows a subject, not a person. Actually, Barthes in his essay, To Write an Intransitive Verb, said that man does not exist prior to the language. It is language that teaches the definition of man, not the contrary. So the point is, there is nothing that comes before the language. So there is no person outside the text who knows and controls the things around him. And the concept of subject emphasizes on the fact that the person is born with the language. Hence, it is the language that holds together the meaning of the text. At this point, Barthes introduces us with the Scriptor. For him, author is a mere scriptor who is born simultaneously with the text, and he or she is not assigned to the operation of recording, representing or depicting anything. Rather, what the scriptor does is performative act, in which the utterance means nothing more than the utterance. For instance, in a play, when the king declares something, it does not mean that the actor is declaring something. What actor is doing is just a performative act. Barthes then moves on to the multidimensionality of the text. He says that the text is a tissue of quotations drawn from the innumerable centers of the culture. That is to say, the underlying system of the culture produces the text, and all that the scriptor does is to assemble it in a particular sequence. So, if I am reading Shakespeare's Sonnet 93, which is, "So shall I live, supposing thou art true," I instantly know that the word art here does not mean a skillful activity such as painting, but it is used for the verb are. But how do I know? Actually, as soon as I read the line, within a fraction of seconds it evokes a chain of associations in my head. All the usage of the word, literally, non-literally, metaphorical, etc. And it interacts with the given context, and that's how I know the meaning, which pre-exists the text. So, what does the so-called author William Shakespeare has done here? Well, I kind of feel irreverent to Shakespeare right now, but according to Barthes, he has done nothing more than mixing together the pre-existing text. All that the scriptor does is to derive and mix the writing from the enormous cultural dictionary. Barthes says that the idea of the author suits the criticism perfectly well, because by finding the author beneath the work, a critic can easily explain or decipher the text, and hence the victory goes to the critic. But since writing is multidimensional, there is nothing to decipher, but to disentangle. Therefore, refusing to assign a secret ultimate meaning to the text leads to the revolutionary activity of multiple meanings. When God was displaced in the Renaissance, the man started looking at the world in a new way that was not fixed on theological text, For instance, Galileo's finding of the Earth orbiting the Sun. Similarly, by displacing the author God, a reader can find a new meaning in the text. In the final paragraph of the essay, Barthes goes back to the question of Balzac and says that no person is speaking that sentence, and yet we can still well read it and make sense out of it because the true place of writing is in the reading. Though the text is made up of multiplicity, there is one place where it is focused, and that place is the reader. Text's unity lies not in its origin, but in its destination, that is to say, the reader. Barthes attacks humanism by saying that it is hypocritical, because classical criticism never paid any attention to the reader. For it, literature is all about one person, and that person is the writer. Therefore, for the future of writing, Barthes says, we have to overthrow the myth of the author. Barthes ends the essay with the note, "The birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author."